Welcome to the first webinar in the PSC Partners 2020 Annual Conference Webinar Series, Coping with PSC for Patients and Caregivers and Epidemic Psychology. Thank you so very much for joining us. My name is Mary Diaz. I'm the president of PSC Partners Seeking a Cure Canada, a registered charity in Canada affiliated with PSC Partners Seeking a Cure in the US. Prior to the emergence of COVID-19, I had been looking forward to a mid-April planned trip to Denver, Colorado for the annual PSC Partners Patient Conference. This meeting has become a highlight of my year. Obviously, this year, it is not safe for us to gather in person, and many in the PSC community are missing each other. We're missing the opportunity to be together, to build community, and to support each other in person. The conference for many is an important part of our toolkit of coping with PSC. And so it is with great pleasure that we bring you this first webinar in the conference series, focused on exactly that, coping with PSC, and for this year with the added focus on epidemic psychology. I'll begin with sharing our agenda for the next hour and a half and reviewing some of the logistics. So we will be starting with presentations from our two speakers on the topics of everyday stresses of living with PSC, challenges and rewards of being a caregiver, and then epidemic psychology and its interaction with the stressors of chronic liver disease. There should be a few minutes for Q&A after the presentations. We'll be addressing questions that were submitted earlier through email, and webinar attendees will also be able to submit questions using the Zoom Q&A tool. Please do not use the chat box for questions. If you enter the questions into the chat box, the questions will not be seen. After the speaker presentations, I will review how to find the Q&A box for those of you who are new to Zoom. Please keep your questions centered on today's topic, coping with PSC and coping in the current pandemic, and try to refrain from asking questions relevant only to your specific situation. The Zoom meeting is set up as a webinar, meaning that aside from the panelists and the moderators, you are attending in listening mode. You cannot be seen or heard. So let's get started with two polls. Can we launch the first polls, please? So the questions that our speakers are asking. Poll 1, since COVID-19 started, what is your stress level? Same, higher, or much higher? And then question 2, are you a PSCer, caregiver, or other? Okay, so it looks like most of us are in the higher category. Some are much higher, and a few have the same stress level. And then we seem to be a pretty much, well, a few more caregivers than PSCers, 50% caregivers, 43% PSCers, and we have a few others with us. Thank you so much for participating. And thank you again for joining us. And now to introduce our panelists and to kick off the webinar, CEO and founder of PSC Partners Seeking a Cure, Ricky Safer.
Hello, thank you, Mary, for reviewing the logistics for tonight's webinar. I too would like to welcome all our attendees today. At PSC Partners, we're all incredibly sad and disappointed to have to cancel our in-person annual conference scheduled in Denver last weekend, to replace it with a series of webinars. We know there is no way to reproduce online the camaraderie, sharing, and bonding that spontaneously happened during our conferences, but we hope that our conference webinars will provide the sought-after education that we have come to expect from our annual meetings. As Mary mentioned, this is just the first in a series of planned conference webinars. The rest of the webinar series will be postponed until summertime, as many of our planned speakers have been called in for additional hospital responsibilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. As requested by our community, this webinar series will include support sessions. On May 7th, we are planning a pilot team Zoom room experience. If that is successful and there's interest, we will plan future Zoom rooms for other peer groups in our community. I'd like to thank our conference co-hosts, University of Colorado Hospital and Children's Hospital Colorado, as well as our other corporate sponsors, Gilead, Mirum, Intercept, Albareo, and Shire, for their support of our virtual conference. We are pleased to be starting our webinar series with the timely topic of coping with PSC, especially with the current overlay of having to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. Added to our unpredictable lives with PSC, now we are all dealing with the weekly and even daily changes in the medical experts' understanding of the virus and shifting professional advice. I find that one of the ways that I'm coping is by searching for hidden humor in our lifestyle. A friend recently sent me a meme with these musing, which I think that many of us can relate to. It says, "Is it morning? Is it Monday or July? Is it still 2020? Did Amazon deliver the 50-pack of Snickers yet? Where are my friends? Is it bedtime? The snacks are gone. I need more chocolate. Is my state open or closed? Where am I?" With that thought, I would like to introduce a couple who is uniquely qualified to help us as patients and caregivers to cope with life with PSC. Dr. Jerome Schofferman is an internist who has practiced pain medicine for more than 30 years. He has had PSC for many years and in 2014 had a liver transplant. As a result, Dr. Schofferman has a perspective of having been on both sides of the bedside. His wife, Dr. Sally Holland, has a PhD in clinical psychology. She is a psychotherapist, a former RN, and a caregiver for her PSC patient husband. We look forward to learning more from them tonight. Sally and Jerome, we'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you all for inviting us. We'd like to thank everybody who has participated in getting this up and rolling. Catherine was just amazingly helpful, and as had everybody else. So we're going to try to lay out the danger that these are difficult times for all of us. Whether we have PSC or we're a caregiver, we really are in unusually high stress levels. The combination of PSC and COVID-19 both have so many features in common. They interfere the flow of our lives. We lose control over parts of our life. And one of the main things is not knowing what the immediate and longer term future holds for us.
And the way I experienced it and still do is the shock of living in this epidemic. It reminded me very much of the shock and disbelief when Jerome was diagnosed with PSC. The same kinds of feelings like, wait a minute, is this reality? Is this, I mean, I liked Ricky's joke, what day is it? Like every time I have to put on a mask when I go outside for a walk, it's another, whoa. Driving into a parking lot of a pharmacy, it's totally empty, and the people wandering around are very few. Our neighborhood feels like a ghost town. It's sort of like, wow, it hits us again in a new way. It's I like the way Jerome put it, 1+1, living in this epidemic, COVID, and also living with PSC, it's like 1+1 = 5.
So with that, we're going to start out with my presentation. I'm going to talk about some of the stresses of PSC and add onto it some of the stresses of COVID-19. So can we please have the slides? I know this is a new experience, some of these webinars, and I think this will work out perfectly, and we'll see. Okay, so can I have the next slide, please? So in terms of looking at the psychological responses to PSC, I want to emphasize that there's no single psychological or social response. There's no right way, there's no wrong way to feel, and psychological responses vary according to each of our psychological makeup, and of course, with PSC, the stage of the disease. Next, please. So as I alluded to, there are different psychological responses according to the stage of illness. And again, there's a lot of overlap back and forth. But early in the diagnosis of PSC, we have the stress of the diagnosis itself. The stress is associated with disbelief, and it can cause an acute stress reaction. I was very anxious, and I know something about it when I first heard that I had PSC. Early in the disease, many of us had no or minimal symptoms. We're working, we're doing normal activities, and we have some fear of the future unknowns, but they're not really that severe. As the disease progresses, and it of course doesn't have to progress in everybody, but in the sort of intermediate phase, we start to feel unhealthy. We start to have more and more tests, some of which are invasive, like ERCPs, and we're beginning to see some interference with the activities of our daily living. Next, please. As we get into the later stages of illness, we're feeling ill most of the time. The treatments haven't stopped the disease. We might be thinking or waiting about thinking about a transplant or even waiting for a transplant. Next, please. So people can go back and forth, but the overwhelming theme of what Sally and I believe, and certainly we are not original in this, is to look at chronic illness as a loss. And next, please. And it's one of the, one part of human nature is we live lots of our life trying to avert losses. And when we have a loss, we usually grieve the loss. And we may not even know that we're grieving the loss. We might break a plate and we get angry. So there are lots of little losses, and maybe they prepare us for a bigger loss. And again, the degree and types of loss vary a great deal, again, by the same thing, how sick people are and the functional impairment. And again, we grieve our losses in different ways based on our prior experiences with loss, as well as our coping strategies. Next, please. So loss is an important theme of what we're going to talk about. And some of the losses that we see in an illness, of course, the most threatening loss is that of longevity. Some people are going to die sooner because of this disease. But hopefully, with some of the work that's going on with possible cures, this will change. But we lose our good health. We lose some of our physical abilities. Some people can no longer work. We lose some of our pride, independence. Many of us lose control. We have to turn it over to our physicians and caregivers. We lose certainty about the future we had planned. And if we get some encephalopathy, we lose some of our thinking clarity. And we also lose intimacy, both sexual and other forms of closeness as the illness progresses. Next, please. So these losses of illness can take a toll, and we do grieve these losses, and whether we know it or not, we are grieving it. Now, many of us are probably familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her work in looking at death and dying. And a lot of what she talked about was grief reactions. And some of the grief reactions were by the patient, him or herself, and some of the grief reactions were by caregivers, family, friends, etc. And when I've looked at this, we've sort of made a change. I like to think of grief reaction to illness as being very similar, but not exactly the same. But of course, we have the denial and disbelief in the anxiety of the diagnosis and what it means. We get angry, although sometimes the anger is very nonspecific. We feel guilty. What did we do wrong to get this disease? anxiety and uncertainty. Some people get depressed and sad, but eventually we hope we come to a phase of integration and adaptation. Now, I just want to repeat, I guess, that these stages don't go along in a linear fashion. We go back and forth, Sally likes to say to and fro, but eventually we hope we come out to the phase of integrating this illness into our psyches and our thinking process. Next, please. So grief after either the death of a loved one, and grief after maybe even when the grief of having an illness, it's sort of easier to understand, because grief after the death or the loss of a loved one usually resolves. With time, a person moves on with his or her life. Next, please. But when you're ill, the grief of dealing with the loss due to a chronic illness can be ongoing. There'll be phases when it's better, phases when it's worse, but it's harder to understand that this is a grief process that we're going through. And sometimes the significance of how it changes our personalities and psyche aren't always appreciated by ourselves as patients or by our caregivers. Next, please. So there's a difference between the grief process of the death and dying model and the grief process of having a chronic illness for which there's as yet no cure. So that brings us down this linear model that doesn't live linearly to anxiety. And basically anxiety in respect to disease is what's the future hold? Nervousness, unease about the future. And these feelings can be continuous, or they can come and go when certain things prompt things. And we'll talk about that when we talk a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder next. So we have fears of many unknowns. My personal worst fear, symptom, anxieties is something I've had throughout this illness, was what I've always called waiting for the axe to fall. Like, oh, I escaped this, my first ERCP didn't show much, but I'm sure the next one will be worse. And I have this thought process defaulting, so to speak, to the negative. Next, please. And that's one of my personal anxiety symptoms that I'm still struggling with all these years later after my diagnosis and transplant. Along with anxiety, and really part of anxiety, are the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And these are symptoms related to usually a single traumatic event. But I think it's fair to say that having a serious illness, the diagnosis of a serious illness, is a traumatic event. And as we go on with our chronic illness, there's frequently times that the PTSD gets reinforced. As an example, times of testing, especially interventional testing. I've always found it's not so bad worrying about the test itself, but what I hated was waiting for the results to come in. So I always have tried to schedule my testing on a Monday, so I would be able to get the test results during the week, as opposed to doing it on a Friday when the weekend interposes and everything takes longer. So that's something I learned that helps me calm my anxiety. And now with COVID-19 and its terrible, terrible effects, this can be for many people a traumatic event that can bring up, cause the symptoms of PTSD. Next, please. So as the last...
Jerome, I just wanted to say something. You mentioned COVID as bringing this up again. It's re-traumatization, isn't it? We get re-traumatized when there's another serious event. And hospitalizations also re-traumatize, but having this epidemic, not knowing how it will affect those with PSC, is definitely re-traumatizing.
Very much so. And then finally, most of us, we hope, will arrive at a phase of integration where we understand that the reality is that this disease is not going to go away, but that doesn't mean we're giving up or conceding to the disease. What we're doing instead is adopting the philosophy that this is what I have and this is what I have to work with. And it's basically adapting to a new normal. Next, please. So, and what sometimes hard to believe, but it seems to be true for many people, at some point in this process, for some people, something new can emerge, a new strength that we didn't know we had. A part of ourselves can come up, some part of ourselves that we really hadn't needed to call on before. And as we go through this process, this can really be a life changer for the good that serves us in other aspects of our life, not just our illness. Next, please. So with all this said, I'm just going to say a couple of words about coping and then move on to some of the more practical aspects. There are basically two ways people cope, either a passive and maladaptive way, where we deny the seriousness of the illness, we use wishing and hoping to get better, and we sometimes seek miracle cures. Next, please. We don't change some of our more harmful behaviors. Then there's the more healthy, active way. We deal with our disease, we get educated, we work with our physicians, we take responsibility. Next, please. We modify our behaviors that might not be in our best interests. So with all that said, let's look at some of the practical issues that confront people in PSC. And these are some of them that I'll talk about briefly. And what I'd like to say is I learned a lot of this from our support group. We have a monthly support group where I live for autoimmune liver diseases. Interestingly, most of the people who attend have PSC, and I really thank the people who have attended for sharing some of their ideas with me. Of course, I'm not going to use any of their personal stories. Next, please. So when we look at isolation, this is a big thing. In our support groups, many people have never met another with an autoimmune liver disease. And they feel alone with a rare disease that they don't discuss with their family or friends. And they come to realize pretty soon that people who aren't ill or haven't been ill just can't understand what we're going through. And this is the value of a group like PSC Partners, local support groups, because we can see we're not alone and don't have to feel so isolated. Next, please. And if there's a local support group that you can attend in person, that's a lot better. Another aspect is social. Basically, people have said that they don't go out much anymore because friends treat me differently. Well, some of that's have changed, of course, with COVID, but a lot of people, especially younger individuals, would socialize at clubs and bars where alcohol and even getting drunk was a big part of it. And part of the social aspect was intimacy. And then the fear of travel. What if I get sick on the way if I go somewhere? Now, a couple of tips I've learned is that with respect to fear of travel, it's useful to even get the names of hospitals near where you're going that treat people with liver disease and do transplants. Next, please. Socially, if you're drinking club soda, you can ask the bartender to put a little cranberry juice in it. It'll make it look less that you're not a social drinker. What about who to tell and not to tell? This is important and difficult, and there's no way to really know what's the best for you. A lot of people you tell just assume that your liver disease might be alcohol related or might be from hepatitis, and we could catch it, whether it's any of the autoimmune liver diseases, including PSC. Next, please. So it's a difficult decision knowing who to tell. Another part that's difficult is that at early stages and mid stages, people with PSC often don't appear sick to other people, but they're fatigued. They can't participate in all the social activities and maybe not able to work full time. And other people just can't quite understand just the main symptom of fatigue. And they sort of look at you askance. And the PSCer might feel guilty that he or she's not pulling their own weight with work or family. Next, please. Another issue that comes up is when the disease is too visible, when a person has edema or jaundice, ascites, weight loss, and it's hard to go out in public sometimes if you have all these visible signs. Again, it's sort of a little intimidating to people with whom you might socialize that you don't know very well. Next, please. Another factor, and I had this in the beginning, is attributing every rumble in my belly, every symptom to being part of PSC. Even body sensations that I've had over the years are interpreted as being due to disease. And this is a common response, next please, to chronic illnesses. What about reactions from other people? People asking, how are you? What do you say if they're just doing it as a friendly greeting? And how do you tell it's not just a real sincere inquiry? Sally and I had the experience of going out to dinner with friends, and one of my friends would lean over the table with me there and whisper, how's he doing? And I would be sitting right there. You'd have to say, hey, I'm here. So these are very individual responses. Next, please. So let's just go to the next slide, please. So basically, one of the last things I'll talk about is being the designated patient. I hated this. As soon as people knew that I had this illness, everybody would talk to me revolving around the illness. It was as if I became the illness and lost all the other aspects of myself. And others might forget that we are really more than our PSC. Next, please. So basically, what are some of the solutions? And I won't go through them all, of course. Communication and trust are the most important. Learning some ways to reduce stress, group supports, physician support, and individual psychotherapy if things are difficult. Next, please. So basically, some last things, expressing gratitude, feeling it yourself, and being grateful that you have availability of good health care, that you have family, friends, and caregivers. Talking about what really matters. Small talk seems to often take second place, rather some of the more intimate discussions. Lastly, have some fun, especially this, yes, this is serious, but life goes on anyway. Next, please. So in summary then, really, PSC is a complex psychological disease. How we deal with it reflects upon our coping abilities, how we sort of grieve our illness as a loss. How we respond psychologically varies according to the severity of the disease and varies person to person. And I can't say enough how our support systems are so important. Next, please. So with that, we're going to change subjects, and I'll turn back to Ricky, who is going to talk about a polling question.
Thank you, Jerome. I think all of us who are patients can recognize our own emotions and reactions throughout your presentation. And I particularly liked your positive comment that after diagnosis, many of us were able to find a new strength that emerged. I think that's sort of thing keeps us all rolling. So that was great. So we're going to have the next polling question. And also, while it's coming up, I just want to remind everybody that if you have any questions for Jerome or Sally, to please put them in the Q&A box. Thank you. All right, so here's the question, and I hope everybody will respond. If you're a caregiver, select your relationship to the PSCer. Are you a spouse, partner, parent, sibling, friend, or other? So, looks like 39% of the people here are spouses and 48% are parents. So that should be interesting for you, Sally. We'll turn it over to you again.
It is interesting. It's good to see that they're siblings and friends also. And most are parents, apparently. And this talk is geared toward spouses and partners. And so my apologies to parents, because we're not going to focus on taking care of children as school age or adolescents, adult children. It's quite different, I think, as we all know, if you've been to other caregiving presentations. But we will address the questions if you have them, and maybe at some point we'll have a seminar that will address more of the parent questions for caregiving. So today I will talk about aspects of caregiving that I've experienced personally as Jerome's wife and caregiver, primary caregiver, and also ways that I understand caregiving from a more professional and clinical perspective. I want to address how to best take care of the health of yourselves as caregivers while also taking care of the health of your loved ones, the person with PSC and others in the family, because I think key to understanding how to take care of your loved one with PSC is to acknowledge that this is a family illness. Everyone in the family, and in many cases extended family, experience aspects of this illness. So siblings, friends, parents, everyone's included, and that it's a lot to have on our shoulders, right, if we're the primary caregiver. That said, I want to talk about that caregiving, basically, we don't come prepared to do this job. It's on-the-job training, basically. There are books and manuals. There's the PSC website, and there are conferences and webinars, but basically this we learn by trial and error, and we learn how not to be overprotective, hopefully. We have to learn that. We learn how to listen without offering advice when none is asked for. We learn to give comfort in new ways. Sometimes it's touch, but it's not always touch. If your loved one with PSC is itching, it's sometimes just being present and reminding the person with PSC that we're in this together and we're going to figure this out. So it's also just learning how to being present when we don't have to fix it or make it better. It's just being there. So one of our favorite lines when we talk about caregiving is caregiving can bring out the best of us and the worst of us, and usually does both. A lot of what Jerome talked about is also true for caregivers. We do discover parts of ourselves that we didn't know we had, strengths that we didn't know we had, creativity, different aspects that really come in handy. And this broadens our sense of self, how we understand our partner and ourselves and what we're capable of. Also, this, for Jerome and me, and for others I've talked to, other caregivers, we got closer. We had to learn how to communicate better. And that was very big. We had to learn how to listen to each other without defending ourselves or listening to the hard stuff that we didn't really talk about before, didn't want to talk about. And you learn how to do that with practice, a lot of practice. And it has many rewards. You get much, we felt closer, and we still do, and it continues. I also want to talk about resilience. This is something that's another reward of caregiving. I think we increase our resilience because we practice it. This definition is simple: bouncing back from adversity. So I think most of the people, the caregivers who are listening today, have experienced kind of a lift when you give to others, when you feel like you have a purpose and you get outside of yourself. And so scientists have done research on resilience and found that the cortisol levels, the stress hormones, actually are reduced in people they've studied who, on the day that they volunteer, the cortisol levels go down. So resilience is a big part of what we need to get through the caregiving role. But what I'm going to focus on, and that you can take that slide away, is some of the negative effects of caregiving, the impact, how we're impacted. I'm talking about this because I think sometimes this is the harder parts of caregiving that don't get addressed enough. PSC is a family illness. I'll stress that again. We find new ways of relating to each other. And as the diagnosis changes, the relating, the caregiving changes. I mean, the stages of the illness is what I meant. I think that the negative effects often showed up for me when I was overwhelmed. I'd become exhausted, and when we're exhausted, it might have been because I was taking on more tasks, more chores around the house. I'm not sure, but especially now with COVID, I'm sure many of you are experiencing a different kind of exhaustion, especially if you're taking care of children and trying to work from home. It's exhausting. And even relating to people through webinars or Zoom conferences, it's not the same as person-to-person contact. It's more tiring. And so we become more irritable, and we may lash out more, and we may not like ourselves that much when this happens. So our resilience is compromised. We can't take care of ourselves in the usual ways, and this is also true of COVID. We can't go to the gym that we're used to going to, or shopping, which is always helpful. So I think Jerome talked about how receiving a life-threatening and chronic illness diagnosis is itself a traumatic event. I think when we hear about PTSD, we often think of war experiences and automobile accidents, but hospitalizations and illness is also part of this category. So I think the emotions that come up when we're facing a shock like this, getting a diagnosis that we have something that we didn't have before, this interferes with our usual sense of ourselves. We often experience more emotions, upsetting emotions than we have before. So fear and anxiety, what will happen next? As a caregiver, I worried about, will he die of this? How will I manage without him what about our future plans? How can we even make plans? Or I had doubts such as, am I equal to this task? Am I going to be able to help him? And how will this affect our marriage? And will we have to change our everyday life? I also experienced anger and incredulity. Like, he's been so healthy. How could this happen? He just, shortly after before Jerome was diagnosed, he had just completed a bike trip with a friend across the state of California. I mean, how could this happen? He's a healthy, strong person who's always taking good care of himself. So these kinds of feelings come up, and they flooded me, I would say. We had a vacation planned at the time. Jerome was diagnosed in September. We were planning on going on a vacation. We canceled the vacation, but we did take time off. We took time off to have a couple weeks for ourselves so we could process what we had just gone through. Because when Jerome was diagnosed, he was pretty sick, and very sick, I should say. And he went through a lot of tests and interventions, such as he had mentioned, the ERCP. So, so during the 2-week time that we took for ourselves to process what we were going through, things got, felt much better. Things kind of went back to normal. And as he started feeling much better, going back to work, and things did seem more normal, I felt much better too, of course. The caregivers are so connected to what your loved one is going through with PSC. So the way I want to explain this, how we process and assimilate trauma, is through the symbol of a pendulum. So could I have that slide? Thank you. So at the time of the diagnosis, during the interventions, we were overwhelmed by the sudden onset of PSC in all the ways I've mentioned: the fear of the unknown, the fear of death, what it would mean for our hopes and plans for the future. The pendulum swung to the far side, and that was emotional flooding. I felt so many things at once. It was overwhelming. When he started feeling better and life sort of went back to normal, I went into a kind of denial, like, this is going to be okay, nothing's really changed, life is fine. Then he wouldn't be so good again after maybe a few months, or start to notice more fatigue, or different symptoms would return, and I would get more flooding. So anyway, the process of assimilating trauma, getting to a point where it's not front and center of your life all the time, this illness, takes time and practice, but eventually you arrive at a place kind of in the middle. So you can, with each hospitalization, I didn't go as far over to the right or the left. It didn't swing as far. The arcs were much shorter. So that's a natural way of dealing with this kind of trauma. I think we eventually can arrive at a place that's in the center. We don't have to be so hypervigilant. We don't catastrophize as much. And that's when it all goes well. When it doesn't go as well, we get stuck one place or the other. And that may give us the indication that we need to grieve some of these losses, because our lifestyle's been changed. And Jerome said that people used to ask him all the time, how are you, or how are you, or ask me, how is he really? They still do. That's the first question often that comes up if we haven't talked to someone for a while. How's Jerome doing? So it doesn't go away, but it doesn't hold the same impact, the front and center trauma that it used to, if we can handle some of these emotional states. And Jerome talked about grief, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but it's what I do want to say is some of the losses that we grieve as caregivers are different from the losses some are similar, some are the same. But the problem that the caregivers may have is that we rank our losses. Like, how can I be feeling bad? I'm not the sick one. He's the one who's really suffering. So we kind of discredit our own feelings of loss. And the way we do that often is just telling ourselves, just get over it, just get over it. We don't, instead we have to grieve. So we don't always know how to grieve because we're usually taught as children to avoid these kinds of states of helplessness and sadness, and maintain a cheerful outlook at all costs. And maintaining a cheerful outlook at all costs takes a toll. It can cut off really honest discussions of how we're feeling. We don't deepen the relationship because we can't talk about certain things. So it's great to keep an upbeat attitude, but not all the time. The reality of the situation is there. Another thing we do is we minimize, as I said, we can rank the losses, some of these ambiguous losses, and that also cuts off our grieving. So I want to switch over now to the ways that we can cope with, with some of these problems. If we're feeling, well, what I found most helpful is having a mindfulness practice. And there are many different ways to practice mindfulness, but I'm going to talk about this quite simple, elegant way that's called RAIN. And it's an acronym for, the R is to recognize what's going on. So you might feel it in your chest, you might feel it in your stomach, you might notice it by your behaviors. You're lashing out at everybody, or you're, as Jerome said, breaking the plate, or something. You're not yourself, and you realize it. So the first step is, hey, something's up. What's going on? And you give yourself time to notice it and to label it. Labeling it can help it from becoming overwhelming. And the A is actually acknowledgement rather than allowing. It's acknowledgement and allowing rather than accepting. You may not accept it yet, but you do acknowledge what you're feeling. It may be guilt at the way you lashed out, or what you said to somebody last night, or it could be anger. It could be exhaustion from feeling overburdened. It could be many different feelings caregivers get. But in the mindfulness training, you allow it, you acknowledge it, you allow it. And the third step is to investigate it. You investigate the inner experience. And by investigating it, you might say, maybe it's because I haven't told my loved one with PSC, I haven't told Jerome what's going on for me lately, and I need to do that. It might be that, one thing I didn't mention in terms of losses, the sort of ambiguous losses, is as a partner and a caregiver, we may not get as much attention as we're used to. We may not feel like we're getting the love or the caring or the understanding that we need. And for married people, partners, we may not feel the same kind of intimacy we've always experienced together. So this needs to be talked about, and it's a hard thing to talk about. So that might come up when you're investigating what's going on right now. And then the other thing is the N. Non-identification simply means this is a state we're going through. It's kind of like we recognize what it is, we allow it, we acknowledge it, we investigate it a bit, and then we can say it's that again. It's another time around. I'm feeling this again, and this is what I need to do with it. It's kind of like when a cloud covers the sun. The sun is always there. That's the wholeness. Your resilient self. That's so much. All of who you are is there all the time. You don't have to identify with a feeling state that you're in right now if it's problematic. So you return to a sense of wholeness, hopefully, when that's possible. You in your full capacity. So that's all I have to say.
That was great. That was really helpful. So we'll close on the subject of epidemic psychology, and this, of course, deals more with COVID-19 than it does with PSC. Next, please. Well, we know from research on multiple different epidemics going way back, truly 1,000 years, what people have written in the Greek times with bubonic plague, of course, more modern, the 2018 infection, HIV, SARS. So we've learned that the three greatest drivers of fear in any epidemic are that the infection is new. It's much different when it's the COVID-19 infection rather than the flu epidemic. That the second, that it's unexpected, meaning we have no idea it was coming. It's not like war that has been building up over time. And third, it's a particularly severe epidemic. So these three criteria, new, unexpected, and severe, are the three greatest drivers in any epidemic. Next, please. And then there are three universal responses to epidemics, and this has been true again since ancient times. There's denial. Again, we see denial, and there's denial by individuals who read about, hear about this particular disease, and then there's another form of denial by governments, and again, without taking any political side. This has been true since ancient times. Governments tend to be late to respond. They distort the facts and figures, and they minimize the threat to the public. Next, please. Then things start to become known, and we become angry. And this goes beyond politics. We get angry at restrictions. We get angry at our church or temple or mosque. We get angry against fate. How, if we were really loved, this wouldn't happen to us. And then the third phase is the rumors. Almost every, next please, every pandemic or epidemic has been associated with rumors, and I'll show how these rumors affect us. So then you can look at epidemics phases, and some have said they're almost like three separate epidemics. There's the infection itself. The second phase is the response of society rather than the individuals. And then the third phase is the need for action. Next slide, please. So the infection itself, as I said, there's initial denial, but eventually you can't deny it anymore. And we come to realize there's an epidemic. More and more people are getting sick. More and more people we read about are dying. At first we think we're immune, but we see soon enough that we are not immune. And we are especially fearful when we see there's no current treatment or vaccine. Next, please. It doesn't matter if you're young or old, healthy or not, you can fall prey to this epidemic. Then there's the second phase, is the sort of psychosocial response that is in part at least mediated by the realization of the severity. And this encourages more fear and more uncertainty. Next, please. And the fear and uncertainty sort of go back and forth. The fear leads to suspicion. The people around us that are not known to us specifically we can start to look at them as potentially dangerous, potentially carriers, and could be the one that passed the infection to me. Even familiar environments might seem dangerous. We worry about the mail, about handrails, the supermarket. So we become suspicious of people and things around us. We're also uncertainty, at least initially, how is the disease transmitted? Well, now we know it's primarily airborne, but what about surfaces, touching surfaces? What about food? And you can see how uncertainty leads to fear. The fear sort of leads to uncertainty. Next, please. And we get into this bad loop. Now, the suspicion often leads to stigmatization and scapegoating, usually against those who have the disease, but against certain groups and types of people. For instance, in this particular epidemic, the stigmatization has occurred against people of Chinese origin, because and our politicians and others start calling it the China virus or the Wuhan virus. This stigmatization really is harmful to ourselves, but more so, of course, to the people against whom the stigma and scapegoating is directed. Next, please. So now we see we have a couple of things set up for the third phase, which is the need for action. And this has to occur on a national and global level. And fortunately or unfortunately, the action often infringes on people's individual rights and freedoms. And eventually, some of us realize that this infringement is for the greater good, and we have to keep that in mind. Next, please. So those are the three phases that are typically talked about. I think there's a fourth phase, which is the recovery phase. And here we have to accept there's going to be a new normal, and things might never be the same. Education might be different, using much more web-based teaching, both in schools and in universities, gatherings, webinars, all different things. Conferences might change. So things might never be the same. Shopping, how long will we have to wear masks? Next, please. So there is a fourth phase, that recovery phase, that will leave us with a world that's different from before this pandemic. Next, please. So then we have to look at the impact on individuals. And then, of course, a very recent research study of 1,200 respondents in China during the heart of the epidemic, almost 54% felt that there was moderate or severe psychological impact from the COVID-19 disease. And you can see almost 30% reported moderate to severe anxiety, almost 17% moderate to severe depression, and about 8% reported moderate to severe stress levels. And there were greater psychological impacts on women, on students, and people who rated their health poor prior to the epidemic. The study also showed that a huge number of people spent most of their day at home, and 3/4 of people worried about their family contracting COVID-19. Next, please. So this study is one of the first actual studies, and the remedies that tended to ease the impact of the psychological illnesses were accurate health information that people could believe, and that was pretty specific to their problem and involved local studies where they lived, not so much the whole country. And following precautionary measures was also helped mitigate the problem. Next, please. So again, it's the theme of loss of control. There's nothing you can do, not knowing what's going to happen, and the anxiety. Here it is, another trauma that can activate any PTSD we might have had, and acute anxiety from the PSC. Next, please. So there are, we'll skip this. Next, please. So I sort of like to look at this as there's a spectrum of individual responses. At one end is those who are in denial. We heard about this all the time. It's a hoax, but even worse, selfishness. The people we saw parading on the beach during spring breaks, there were a lot of them on TV. I won't get this, I won't catch this. I'd rather enjoy myself, I'll take the risk, not thinking that if they got sick, they would pass it on to others. And they value their personal freedom, even though it wasn't as safe for the public. Their personal freedom was jeopardizing the health of the community around them. Next, please. Then on the other end of the spectrum is the overreactions. People with very high anxiety levels and panic, they would feel overwhelmed. These are people who tended to hoard, and those who follow every new cure and hype that's out there. Next, please. And then there's the group most sensible. We take the infection seriously, but we keep a sense of proportion. We use the reasonable measures that we've been taught to prevent the spread, and we tolerate the disruptions of life because we know this is society's good. Now, I would like to just say that people in the healthcare, nurses and doctors and first responders are in this most sensible group, and we have to really thank them for pushing themselves so hard, realizing they were jeopardizing potentially their own health. Next, please. So there are some ways to minimize anxiety, and I'll be closing with this. First, limit our exposure to the news. Maybe an hour a day, maybe just reading some site you trust. But I would say trust only independent sources, neutral sources like the CDC, like Anthony Fauci, and articles reproduced from medical journals. Don't trust the polarized media and most politicians, no matter which side of the aisle. Next, please. Again, safety, being active if you can, working out inside, having social contacts, very important. Isolation causes high stress levels, making virtual visits, phone calls, if you can exercise safely outside. And then the practical stuff, you can do chores that you've been putting off, learning something new, meditation, relaxation, mindfulness, trying to make up a schedule and sticking to it. And as Sally said before, helping others if it's reasonable, friends, neighbors who might be at higher risk. Next, please. So that's about all we'll talk about this evening. I hope that some of these things are helpful and can give you some things to think about and expand how we look at PSC, how it interacts with our current illness, how caregivers and patients are so intimately related. Thank you for listening and watching. And now we'll go back to Mary.
Thank you so much, Jerome, and thank you, Sally, as well. Amazing talks, so much food for thought there. It also reminds me, one of your comments that you made about the need for real communication, deep communication. I think that's one of the reasons the PSC Partners conferences are so valuable, is because in that very safe place, we get right down to the real stuff. Anyway, I'm going to give some instructions about the Q&A, and then we will start doing some questions. So for the attendees, if you would like to enter a question, please use the Q&A icon to submit the Q&A box to submit your questions. At the bottom of your screen, you should see the Q&A icon. You may need to use your mouse to move your pointer to hover over the bottom of the screen, the Zoom window, to see the Q&A icon. You may submit your questions anonymously or not, your choice. Regardless, only you, the panelists, the hosts, question moderators, Rachel Gomel and Joanne Hatchett, will see your questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. When you submit a question, please put the name of who you are addressing the question to at the beginning of your question. Please keep the questions general. We will not have time for specific questions about an individual situation. So, okay, let's get started with a question that came in earlier by email. Jerome, this is for you. So the question is, with many of us being at high risk, how can we get over the fear to leave our homes when people aren't following the rules to wear masks, personal distance, etc.?
That's a very important question, and something that I've sort of been dealing myself, and I can relate to that. I'm on immunosuppressives after liver transplant, and so I'm particularly aware of that. There's two thoughts about this. One is, most important is protecting ourselves. As an example, wearing a mask, and needless to say, wearing the mask is more toward protecting others, but there are ways now that you can improve your home mask to make it as good or better than an N95 by using a mask, a cloth mask with like from a bandana or whatever, and then taking a silk stocking and nylon shows you how old I am. Nylon stocking, and using it as the outside, and tying it so it's tight to your face, and the stocking gives you still the ability to breathe, but by giving you a secure fit, it makes it very effective. The second thing is you have to walk away from people who are not adhering. When we go for a walk, many times we have to walk out in the street to get around somebody who's not carrying the 6 feet, not obeying the 6 feet guideline. We don't bicycle because the wind stream behind a bicycle is really far, maybe 30 feet. And so we don't want to get stuck in the wind stream of somebody who passed behind us. We've called on neighbors to pick up food for us. And we've been fortunate in our neighborhood, at very low additional cost, we can get food either delivered or we can pick it up from our local market. And lastly is sometimes you have to politely say to people, excuse me, you're not really obeying the guidelines. Do you mind stepping back a little? We have to be honest, but we have to be polite. Sally?
Well, we've also encountered people that don't wear masks and who don't social distance on trails. And what most people do wear masks, but when they don't, what we always do is sort of crab walk. So we turn our backs to the people, and they turn their backs to us usually too. You can ask them to, let's try to practice social distancing.
People are receptive to that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So before I ask our next question, we do have a comment here, came from one of the attendees saying that if you're using the app, then the Q&A box is on the upper right, not the lower part of the screen. So I hope that helps.
Mm-hmm.
So our next question just came in for Sally. How do you suggest helping a caregiver who's in denial that their loved one is really seriously ill?
Oh, yeah, that's big. There's something that comes to my mind. It's called motivational interviewing. This kind of could be applied to this question because you can ask I think the question, Ricky, was how do you convince someone that this is real?
Yes.
Convincing what?
Particularly a spouse.
The caregiver?
Yes.
The spouse. Okay.
Spouse who's your caregiver.
Yeah. Has your life changed in any way? I mean, asking these questions, or how has your life changed since this illness? And if there's, well, not really. Well, do you still, can you spontaneously invite friends over for dinner? Or can you decide you want to have a picnic on a nice day without planning ahead of time? Or do you ever get disappointed that plans have changed, that we can't do what we were, take the vacation we were hoping to take? So that kind of interviewing where they have to kind of look at themselves, look at their lives. I'm trying to think of something else.
You might, what if you point out those very things that you were asking the questions, if the person doesn't have a response and say, well, why do you think you're tired and taking a nap every afternoon? So the things you said, asking those questions is good.
Why do you think your spouse takes so many more naps than they used to, or something like that, you mean? Or, yeah, do you feel as connected? Are you feeling as connected as you used to? Or is there sort of a, often the person who's ill, who feels sick all the time, there's no room to bring other people in. You're just consumed by the symptoms. I think asking those questions and waiting for the answer, or as Jerome said, asking, what do you think? I hope that helps.
Yes, great.
Thank you so much. So here's another question that's come in. Jerome, this is for you. My husband hates when people ask how he's feeling. We know they're being kind, but it just keeps reminding both of us he's sick. Is there any way to deal with this? So you mentioned this a bit in your presentation. How do you deal with it?
Well, it depends if I know the person, how I know the person, but I have over time developed a series of responses. Like if sometimes I'll ask somebody I might answer, I'm sorry, well, do you really want to know? Or how much time do you have? And answering something like that. But if you know the person well, then it becomes a sincere question, perhaps just an update, and I would answer it truthfully with how I'm feeling. One of the things I think I learned is in our society, we don't like to admit we don't feel good to others. And so when someone asks that question, people can deny it. Deny their illness. So I think an honest answer or something politely snarky, if there's such a combination of words, but an honest answer is really a reasonable thing to offer. And it's just comes up all the time when people see you as just being your PSC liver.
This is my time. Here's one for Sally. This is from a parent. So how can I manage my children's stress and be a source of hope and model resilience for them? How can I tap into feelings of hope and positivity when I'm not feeling that way?
Wow, great question. Yeah. I think kids know when you're being honest. And I think the question is addressed by how can I be this way with my child who's ill or who has a diagnosis of PSC. I think kids know when you're not being honest, so it's okay to say, I'm feeling sad right now, or I'm feeling, I don't quite understand what's going on. This is hard for me. Is it hard for you? And then the honesty opens something up. It can, for both the parent and the child. Like, they can be honest then too. And I think that not feeling positive or hopeful or happy can also be explained as this is a natural part of living, right? This is, I wish we could feel happy most of the time, but we don't. And life is a state of constant change. I think what kids really need is a sense that they are being taken care of, that sense of we're in this together, we're going to get through this. They need to feel supported, they need to feel safe. And that's different from feeling sad. And you can still be supported, you can still make a child feel safe, and you can still be sad together. So.
Okay, here's a question for Jerome. So how might stress impact my PSC symptoms, And also, what about non-PSC physiological impact of cumulative stress?
Well, we know several things. We know that the stress has both hormonal and other physiological effects on our body. So in terms of stress and PSC, it's probably true, although I don't know of anybody who's researched it with this specific setup, but stress can exacerbate symptoms and probably alter our immunological status. So more stress, less resistant to any illness. I think many people know that when they get sick with even a cold, it's often in times when they're feeling stressed. And then the second part of it is something Sally showed in one slide, is the effects of chronic stress. And chronic stress has many hormonal effects. As we heard from Sally, it raises cortisol levels, and persistent elevation of cortisol has a lot of deleterious effects on our body in terms of blood pressure, in terms of heart. There's much higher rates of other diseases in people with chronic stress-related states. So stress has a lot of unwanted physiological effects, lowering our resistance and making symptoms worse.
Thank you. Sally, this is another parental question. My children's life is exclusively on Zoom with school and friends. We can't have any impact on their intense virtual life. We see that this life is stressing them and us. What changes do you suggest?
Wow, that's a big one. It's huge. I think all parents really struggle with this. And we actually went to a talk on this. It was given by someone from Silicon Valley whose own kids, he's limited their computer time. He's taken away iPads, et cetera, because of the effects. But now with sheltering in place, staying home, that's all they have, right? They don't go to school. You can't get out. You can't meet with your friends like you used to. So what do? When a parent is working, it's particularly hard because you don't want the kids making noise in the background or making demands. That's the time when kids can be on their computers. Many of them are doing online classes, so that helps. But after that, there can be limits placed. And it's hard to fit in reading to children, getting them off their screens, but you can be honest, I think most people know that screen time can have bad effects. It can make people more depressed even. And so if you can introduce board games, in fact, I just heard of a really good one on a podcast I listened to, which is called Code Words. I don't know, you know that one, Mary? Do you? Okay, so
it's good.
You can do games. A lot of the games are on Zoom, though, however, right? So you don't want to do those. You want to do card games. You want to do board games. You want to read books. What I've done is I have my 9-year-old grandson read to me every day for a half hour. It helps improve his reading. Giving them, of course, he reads it from a regular book, but unfortunately we are on Skype. So there's the screen again. But he's looking at his book. He's not looking at an ebook. I wish there were a good answer. I think there are a lot of books on this subject, how to limit time, but not how to limit time when there's a COVID, when we're living with a COVID epidemic and kids are at home all the time. Getting kids outside, but if they're young, they don't understand the limits, right? They don't understand they can't play with their friends or they can't go to playgrounds. There are ways that other parents have found to creatively work with these situations, but I can't really go into all that now, maybe at another time.
Yeah, I might add just two things. The book that Sally was referring to, even though when I do this, it comes out mirrored, was The Hacking of the American Mind. And it's really eye-opening.
It didn't come out mirrored. You can hold it up. It didn't come out mirrored.
Oh, so it's the hacking of the American mind, and it's all about what the question and what Sally's answer. But I would just say, during the thing, getting the kid off the screen means entertaining a child in other ways. And once kids are sort of habituated to the screen, I can't expect them to go out and do it on their own. So it requires the parent or parents to do things interactively with the child that might be fun. That's why I like Sally's board games, card games, things that don't involve screens.
Jerome, could you tell us who the author is?
Oh, the author is Robert Lustig, Lustig, MD. And we heard him talk. He's also written about sugar addiction. And he's really onto something with the effects of screens on dopamine and other brain hormones. And it was sort of scary how much data he had. So, but it's a great book and it's not a hard read.
Thank you. Okay, here's a question. We received a few questions about this topic. So people are writing in about sleep. And so some people are saying that they're having COVID dreams or nightmares. Some people are having difficulty falling asleep, and some people are waking up with anxiety. Do you have any suggestions?
I'd love to address that. We both can, because I meant to say something about this in my talk, and I guess I ran out of time, or as part of self-care. Sleep is so important. Sleep, exercise, outdoor exercise, being in nature, all these things are such a part of self-care. But sleep, for me, has been a problem actually since, I think it started when Jerome got sick. So I've been working on this a lot, and I've heard experts talk about it. And one thing that's really helped me is to reduce the amount of blue light at night. That means wearing yellow glasses if you watch TV later, or if you're on your screen, you wear yellow glasses, which block out the blue light. And blue light stimulates the hormone serotonin, which is the waking hormone. We want more melatonin, and that's the sleeping hormone. So some people recommend turning off, or even they buy new light bulbs even for the bedroom, so they don't have any of the blue light coming in after 6 p.m. And that's especially important for kids. But the yellow glasses have helped me a lot. There's a lot written about sleep hygiene, and I think you can probably look that up on the internet. But the blue light is part of it, reducing blue light and not having stimulation close to bedtime, too hot of a bath, or too much exercise. I'll just briefly say that. Maybe Jerome can add something.
Well, I think the relaxation training, part of mindfulness also includes, I wouldn't call it meditation necessarily, but relaxation training. And once it's a skill, and once you develop that skill to some degree, it's really helpful for falling asleep. Some people say reading in bed is good. Others say it's bad for sleep hygiene, but I think you have to try what works. We try to avoid sleeping pills, but every once in a while people do need it, but on rare occasion. And that you have to talk with the physician about which medications are not metabolized by the liver. That would be important. But I found relaxation training at bedtime and not watching TV in the evening is helpful, especially scary things that really give you nightmares.
Thank you. So our
I
last,
find,
I'm sorry.
oh,
Go ahead, Sally.
one thing I wanted to say, I think it's having COVID dreams, it'd be interesting to hear the dreams because dreams can be very helpful in processing information. I think there's lots of mystery around dreams, but I don't know if it's a nightmare kind of a dream. It sounds like it probably is. And repetitive dreams, they all have meaning, or they can. In my opinion, they do. And they help us process information. But you might want to talk to someone about it. That's part of having a support system, which I also didn't say. Talking to a therapist can be helpful at this time if your support system isn't available, or if it can't handle some of your experiences.
Thank you. So as a last question, this is actually for both of you, Jerome and Sally. As a couple who's been through transplant and beyond, you have shared many stressful moments. Is there anything you learned from going through all that together that could help us to smooth out our own close relationships at this stressful time?
Jerome, you start.
Okay, well, I think the things that I would say is acknowledging the scary, the fear, acknowledging the fear of whatever the experience is, and not trying to cover it up and sort of be macho. Not that I could ever be macho, but covering it up and but letting those fears come up, because that's the only way you can deal with them. And then the other thing is what Sally talked about so much: communication, talking about our fears and sharing the scariness of the experience, and not offering false hope. You know, this will be all right, this will be okay. No one knows how this is going, how something as serious as an illness will turn out. So no false hope, and communication, and really were helpful for me.
And also, marriage itself is a work in progress, right? It's you're always working things out. There are always issues that come up, like why is this still happening? Why are we still having these same arguments? They eventually go away because they become irrelevant, but in the thick of it, they don't. They're painful and isolating and scary. And I think what Jerome said, the communication, but how to establish a way to communicate, a way to learn active listening. One thing is you don't talk about things right in the heat of the moment. You find a time, like let's talk together about something that's on my mind. Let me know when you have some free time. And so there's preparation. It's not like, bang, hey, I'm upset about this. What do you, I mean, it's, you give the other person preparation time, and you take it yourself. So that's one thing that I think we found helpful.
The other thing we have tried to do, and we started for a while and then don't do it, is checking in with each other. Is when in the morning, but especially during times of I don't want to call it crisis, but times such as after a transplant or after a hospitalization, checking in and how each of us is feeling and how we're affecting each other.
Okay, thank you. Jerome and Sally, thank you so much for your honest, personal, and excellent presentations with your practical lifestyle tips. I know we all learned a lot. It was terrific. I want to thank everyone for participating in tonight's webinar. Please watch for our future conference webinar announcements, which we will post on social media, in our newsletters, and on our website. Be sure to visit the COVID-19 page on our website, as it is full of useful COVID resources, plus a recording of our March webinar on PSC, IBD, and COVID-19, What You Want to Know. If you are a PSC patient and you've been diagnosed with COVID-19, please take a few minutes to fill out the short anonymous survey so that we can gather important data on that topic for our community. Please feel free to send us your comments about this webinar and suggestions for future webinars at contactus@pscpartners.org. Thank you again to our webinar series sponsors, our conference co-hosts, University of Colorado Health and Children's Hospital Colorado, and our other corporate sponsors, Gilead, Mirum, Intercept, Alvareo, and Shire, for their support of our virtual conference series. Thank you all. This was wonderful. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.